as I said the last time, I'll give you a little Israel update as long as it um, things here are always interesting. Maybe they'll be hopefully less interesting in the future. But as far as the news, one of the most important things happening in Israel now is that Netanyahu has finally taken the stand in his 8-year long going corruption trial. Uh, as an American, I'm outraged that a person is under this cloud of investigation for 8 years. The whole idea of a speedy trial just doesn't seem to exist here. In fact, the longer I live here, the more fault I am finding with the Israeli judicial system on in many areas. The trial, which is called corruption breach of trust, many of you know, is that he received cigars and champagne and shirts from a wealthy person as gifts. Um, there's some kind of bribery trying to get better coverage in the news. Apparently, he called somebody and asked them, "Hey, could you give me better coverage?" And as far as I understand, he helped someone get a passport. And so this was understood to be some kind of bribery. And bribery, of course, requires a quid pro quo. And what the defense is saying, you know, getting a wealthy philanthropist a passport is in the best interest of the state. It's not for him. And he said, I don't drink champagne. I never finished a cigar. And there was no quid pro quo. Someone gave me a gift. And so as he's beginning to present his case, I think the word corruption and breach of trust are such profound words. I think people are now actually paying attention why the prime minister has to spend 8 hours a day, 3 days a week in a trial instead of running the war, dealing with the situation on the northern and southern borders, the terror situation on the West Bank, and managing the release of the hostages. In fact, some hostages' families, which have been, I think, uniformly, well, as far as we know, critical of Netanyahu, have actually said, why at this point have you decided after 8 years it's time for him to be testifying maybe 6 hours a day, 3 days a week instead of running the country? And I think that from I've always felt these charges should, they're in a local district court, by the way. It's not even a so-called federal case. Um, I personally think this is my politics. I could be very wrong. I actually think there's great animus toward Netanyahu in many parts of the judicial system and the police and the Israeli version of the FBI. That's what he's claiming. Many people claim it. Could be very wrong. It might be completely fair and impeccable. But the more I'm here, the more I find that there's evidence of simply great animosity toward him. Again, others say it's not. It's all completely above board. Um, but anyway, he's finally taken the stand. And as he's taken the stand in his defense, fascinatingly, his numbers in the polls have gone up, uh, meaning they're finally realizing that this 8-year investigation, probably costing untold sums of money, a witness list of with 300 people on it, a 93-page indictment that is filled with hyperbole and invective, and it comes down to very little. Now, unfortunately, the prosecution can't pull back and say this guy Mandelblit, who brought the charges 8 years ago, maybe he overreached a little bit. But here's the fascinating thing. And all the time that I've been reading the Israeli news every day carefully since the judicial reform protest began back in about January 2023, the first time I've seen people report on Netanyahu not in an accusatory way. Someone wrote a front page on one of the news stations, the terrible toll this has taken on Sarah Netanyahu and the son Yair, who's always been described as more right wing than his father. He suddenly became a human being, this young person, and the toll that's taken on the Netanyahu family. I've seen other reports on the trial. The first time, and I'm speaking sincerely with you, the first time I've actually seen objective reporting about Netanyahu. So, Shanti, when I saw your poem, it was the good news. The good news for me, again, this is, I'm speaking as an American. that the deepest calling of a free press is as much as possible to report the news fairly. Now, we know that doesn't happen. We know that news organizations, as it were, are always politically aligned, as are the courts. The idea of a court system beyond politics, we know it doesn't happen. That the political opinions of judges does play into their rulings. I find it tragic. I find it sad. I find it sad for me that Israeli society is so riven by, torn apart by the. I think, in my opinion, a judicial system that seems to want to run Netanyahu out of government, especially this the so-called Israeli um, Attorney General, which is really a Supreme Court monitor, monitoring the Likud government, uh, in their mind, making sure that what he does is fair. They call it svirut here, savir, fair and reasonable, without a judicial standard, by the way. And I've talked to many people, and they say Netanyahu and his government are not trustworthy. You need this government monitor to make sure that they don't, commit terrible, grievous errors as they rule the country. The other side says, well, we elected him to rule, let him rule. So again, as an American, it's a bit beyond my comprehension, the idea that a representative of the Supreme Court somewhat micromanages the government. And it's led to just years of acrimony and dispute. So just as from an American here, with the American idea, you elect someone to rule, you let them rule, and if you don't like what they do, you vote them out next time around. It's an American view. I think here the idea is you elect someone to rule, but the Supreme Court on a daily basis makes sure they don't make mistakes. That might be the right way to go. Maybe my American point of view is not valid. But the main thing is, what we hope in the press is that there is some reporting of the other side. It's starting to happen, which of course calms people down. That the other side is not simply the incarnation of evil, but actually has a point of view. Um, so I'm really glad it's happening. I'm not saying Netanyahu is not guilty of the things charged, and he might have to resign, and his government might fall. But at least there seems to be, in the eye of the public, a greater understanding of what indeed he's being charged with. So for me, that's the good news. The good news is not that he's going to get away with anything that he did, but the clamor that in Israel they're fighting against pure evil. I mean, people hate Netanyahu more than they hate Hamas. I know it might astonish you, but it's true. He's blamed for everything Hamas did is Netanyahu's fault, according to a sizable part of the country. So I'm very relieved that that is happening. In fact, reporters have said one of the most astonishing things, in Israeli history is that the entire Syrian military capability has been destroyed within a few days. Now, in the other time, this would have been recorded as a huge Israeli victory. It was almost yesterday's news because the trial was so important. The idea that we're on the cusp, apparently, of a hostage deal, again, was two or three uh, um, news stories down in the news. This is such big news that this 8-year saga is, as it were, it is going to work itself out. The justice system has worked. He is on trial. He is testifying. Everybody's feared that there's a fascist takeover, that Israel is going to be, fall under the grip of a tyrant. That's clearly not true because he's on trial and he's forced to testify. He says, "I'm glad to testify. I finally get to tell my side." So Syria has been basically been defamed. Whoever takes over the country, there seems to be a hostage deal with Hezbollah out of the picture. Iran pushed back somewhat. We think here that this has pushed Hamas toward a deal. I don't trust Hamas. I don't think they're going to release all the hostages. I think whatever happens, they're going to keep a few back, maybe all the currently serving soldiers whom they capture. But any hostage that returns is better. It's an ongoing grievous wound for Israelis. Another little piece of news is that there are Druze communities on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is like a huge like set of ridges that goes down the Israeli side, down the Syrian side, where there are Druze communities on the Syrian side. They have, in a formal way, requested that Israel annex Druze communities into Israel. It's on the news. You can hear the Druze leader speaking to his people, and he said, "This is not ideal in a theoretical sense, but being annexed to Israel is the lesser of the two evils. One evil is being massacred if the jihadists take power. The other evil is being ruled by Israel. There's a large Jewish population in Israel. They're doing great. They're highly respected. They're in the army. They're fully integrated in. I mean, they isolate themselves. By the way, the Jews is an incredible mystery religion. I wish I knew more about it, but nobody does. It sounds very, very intriguing to me. They call it, by the way, a Neoplatonic mystery religion. Wow. I want to study that religion. But you can't get into it. Anyway, so the Druze in Israel are for an isolated community are rather fully integrated. In fact, our daughter's mentor when she was in the army was a Druze major who took a liking to Abigail and mentored her entire military service and became a friend of the family. And so the Druze in across the Golan Heights want to be annexed to the state of Israel, which is very likely completely impossible. And Israel does not want to take over Syrian territory. It's not going to look good for the world. But look, and the whole world knows. The whole world knows that they would prefer to be ruled by, but as horrible as Israel is, apartheid state, and commits war crimes. Well, people want to be annexed, and you know illegal immigrants are still flowing into Israel, from Sudan and other places. So it's just one of these ironic things you see in the news that points that there's other things going on. Um, Israelis are again, regardless of what we Americans might think about Trump being elected, Israelis are relieved, especially in his bellicose attitude toward the ICC, the International Court of Justice, which Israelis think is a complete sham. Is no interested in justice. Is motivated by deep hatred of the state of Israel. That Trump has said, more or less, we're going to have your back. They're not going to get away with this. This constant drumbeat that Israel is the worst nation on the face of the planet. Forget about Putin. Forget about North Korea. Forget about the true genocide happening in Sudan. Forget about all those places. All the attention goes to Israel. Um, that 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 Trump in his typical way of throwing elbows is not playing a careful diplomatic game, more of a of a the buffalo in the china shop saying, yeah, you're not going to get away with it on my watch. So again, as half the country really did not want Trump to be president, even though there was a great electoral vote win. It was on the popular level, it was much more close. Israelis are, I think, 80 to 20, very, very relieved that Trump won the election. So the feeling here is, as I've said before, grimly optimistic. Grim because of the great wound of the slaughter on October 7th of 100 Israelis still being held captive, of the terrible loss of life in this war. Again, we see their pictures every day in the news, these fine young men and women being killed on both fronts, ongoing terrorist attacks. So that it's there it hurts the souls of Israelis, and of course of us too, seeing ourselves more and more as part of this. On the other hand, that there does seem to be some kind of better future awaiting. All right, that's my Israel report, and that's the good news. So thank you, Shanti, for for again predicting what I wanted to talk about today. I'll take a quick question, then I want to go for my teaching for tonight. Mickey, you got a quick question over there?
Yeah,
Sure,
two questions. One,
sure.
ironically, just before your broadcast, NBC News announced that it looks like a deal is being cut with Hamas to release. Is that again just out of the NBC newsroom, or is there actual action going on in Israel that makes that a somewhat accurate report?
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I didn't read the news this morning, untypical of me before I got on. And the feeling here is Hamas wants a deal. They've lost the Hezbollah was supposed to come in and force Israel into a bad deal. Well, they're gone. Um, Iran has been defanged as far as we know. So Hamas is relatively isolated and will be for a long time. And of course, Israel operations are going on. I mean, the recent one was they discovered yet another cell of Hamas in northern Gaza getting ready to launch rockets. In fact, a few rockets did get launched. They didn't cause any damage, but a dozen of them were wiped out. The operations are still going on, and every day another dozen Hamas members trying to commit terrorist attacks are killed. A few Israeli soldiers are killed. We lost 7 people in one day last week. Again, terrible tragedy. You look at their faces, you look at their work.
Yeah.
Um, so as bad as it is for Israel, it's worse for Hamas. And I think what they see is they're just going to keep losing 10, 15, 20 people a day unless they stop this. So yes, everybody here believes that a deal is closer than ever. Of course, we'll only know when we see 100 people get on buses and come across the border. Yeah, it's almost too good to be true. We've been living with this for since October 7th a year ago, and the idea that Hamas actually might be releasing hostages without getting one of their core needs is that Israel completely leave Gaza. And Israel said we're not leaving Gaza. We'll stop fighting, but we're not leaving Gaza in short term. And apparently Hamas has agreed to that condition. There's a big prisoner swap part of this. In fact, maybe thousands of Hamas operatives are being returned. And Israel's point is nobody who participated on October 7th is going to be returned. They're going to be brought to justice. And that's probably what the negotiations are right now is which Hamas operatives will be traded for the 100 hostages. And it seems to be in the thousands. And I think from Israel's perspective, it's worth it.
Can I
Uh,
just have one follow-up secular question? Do you mind?
okay. Mhm.
Because, our news is so filtered here. I think most people come to the conclusion, I suspect in Israel and in the United States, that um, he was the dictator in Syria. He was a horrible, vicious, vile human being.
Mhm.
Now the question becomes, are the people who, quote, overthrew him, what is their character? Are they as equally dangerous in their own way?
Yeah.
That's always a concern.
Well, in the Israeli news, there are several former Israeli, for example, a former Israeli Mossad chief who feel free to, on their own as private citizens, engage their contacts. So have several have said they have informal contacts with several of the groups that overthrew Assad. So there's about 20 military groups that were under this umbrella of the Mordim, the rebels. They have a unified leadership as far as the military, but now they've fractionalized into their different groups, and their leadership says there we don't want any more war. That's been emphatic. No more war with each other or against Israel. Now, putting Turkey aside, that wants to use this as an opportunity to make war on the Kurds. Put that aside. Univocally, people are saying whatever they are, they don't want more war. In fact, one of these groups said to an Israeli former general who has contacts with them, they said, "We can't wait." Take a deep breath. We can't wait for the day that an Israeli embassy opens in Damascus and will move into the former Iranian embassy and flies the Israeli flag in Damascus. Like I thought, I said, wait, I had to
That
rewind.
just seems incredible to me.
It's. I mean, Robert, I looked at her and said, what world are we living in? And he said,
Exactly.
no, he said the hatred for Assad and
Was that
by
was that bad?
Iran, because Iran was behind these torture chambers and the brutality of Assad was propped up by Iran. So Iran is sending, olive branches. I think people there are turning into arrows and shooting right back at Iran. You tortured us. That's not forgivable. So we don't know what's going to happen, but there's been nothing coming out of the rebels that next we're going to march on the Golan Heights. Nothing like that has come out. They've said nothing remote of that. In fact, the Israeli destruction of the warfighting capability of the Syrian army, which is no longer there, they haven't protested. A Spanish foreign minister apparently said that Israel is now committing genocide in Syria, which for me is it's laughable that their definition of genocide now is blowing up Iranian jets and ships. That's now genocide. And the rebels have not said a word. They haven't protested. They haven't taken it anywhere. So they say, we're not going to use it anyway. So yeah, go ahead and get rid of it. So there we just have to almost pinch ourselves. Now it could all go very badly. So Netanyahu has sent the Israeli army into the Syrian buffer zone so that they don't get up the Golan Heights and start terrorizing the Israelis on the Golan Heights. The Druze want to join Israel on the in the area of the Golan. The rebels have not said anything bellicose toward Israel in general, or because of the Israeli destruction of I'm going to say the former Syrian army warfighting capability. The hostages might be coming home. Uh, I think Israel is calming down over Netanyahu. I think they really actually want to hear what he has to say. Like he's on the defense down now. He gets to talk. So, again, aside from soldiers dying and terrorist attacks on the West Bank, I think there's a sense that things might get better here. So, um, uh, anyways, I'm remembering the day we have this little duplex, two studio apartments, one on top of the other here, and I was on the porch. I'm downstairs now, but back in I guess it was August when Iran said they're going to strike, and there's consensus here. There's going to be a ballistic missile strike on Israel. I stood on our porch and I looked at the skyline of Tel Aviv, and I thought to myself, as most Israelis did, will this city be here tomorrow? We had no idea what the Israeli defense against a ballistic missile attack would be. And a sense that, it's like we're in a war. We're in a war. And they might be able to, you know, penetrate defenses. But again, there's a sense of we looked at each other and said, Milchama, it's a war. I didn't feel fear. Everywhere we went, we were going from one national, the Israeli insurance and here and there, and to the bank and on the street. Milchama, it's a war, and a resilience. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel fear. Just it's a war. I looked at the skyline. I said, well, I hope most of us here tomorrow. I hope I'm here tomorrow. And of course, instead, we saw this Israeli preemptive strike against Iran, and we woke up and said, we might get through this. It was not a foregone conclusion that Tel Aviv was not going to be destroyed. I want to say to you, we did not assume that. We assumed that there's going to be those 300 ballistic missiles that were shot, that a good number would get through and then land right here in Tel Aviv. And Rob and I said, well, we have our reinforced room. It's stocked up, and hopefully it won't be a direct hit on our building or anybody else. But we were thinking about ourselves, and okay, hope uh, we hope we wake up the next morning and the city's still here, and it was. So we it's been traumatic.
Yeah. Well, thank you so
When,
much for
yeah,
for
when you're. I'm
advocating.
sorry.
I know I tend to get a little over crazy about the
Yeah,
politics from this
yeah. I think
from this point of view to figure out, like, are there any good guys? That's the problem. Are there any good
well,
guys?
look. I mean, the peace with the Gulf states, with
Yeah.
Egypt, I mean, for all that Israel is horrible. No, none of these states, no Arab Muslim state has broken off diplomatic relations with Israel, right? That actually says something.
Yeah.
In any case, that's enough of the Israel report. I know you're interested, and I don't want our Shabbos taken over
No,
by
no.
this, but
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
I,
Thank you.
I, I really think I need to give you an update on not just my opinion what's happening, but the feel here in the country, and to try to speak not just for myself, but what all I know is what I read in the papers or in the virtual papers. And I'm smiling because I'm happy to be with you. And as I'm talking, I'm realizing, wow, I'm kind of on the grim optimistic. I'm a little more optimistic than I am grim. So that's what's going on here. I'll try to segue that into my teaching for today.
Okay. Thank you.
I again, I'm doing something I've always wanted to do, which is take a part of the Bible and study, share with you the depth to which I study it. And so for those who have not liked this, I think they're going elsewhere on Friday. But for me, I get to do something I've always wanted to do. It's on my bucket list. So a few wind-up comments. I'm seeing Lydia there. Hey, Lydia. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you choke on your wine. So Lydia brought up the connections between Steinbeck's East of Eden and what I was teaching, shared with us a wonderful quote a couple of weeks ago. So I've gone more into Steinbeck and and the parts of East of Eden, which is taken directly from what we're teaching. And I'm taking the Cain and Abel story into his book, and especially the Chinese scholars who learned Hebrew to understand the word timshol, which means you may rule over it, meaning uh, the urges of Cain that those verses predicted, his murderous urges, of course, that he gave into, and there's a scholarly debate because Steinbeck translates it Tim Shell instead of Tim Scholl. It's going around and around and around, and so I'm going to share with you again. It's a private idea. It doesn't take a side on the debate because Tim Shell seems to just be a mistransliteration of Tim Scholl. However, there is another Hebrew word from the root mem shin lamed, which is mashal, means to govern or to rule. For example, the sun and the stars are mem shelet hayom and laila. The sun governs the day, the moon and stars govern the night. Mem shala means government. A moshel is a governor. Um, but the word mem shin lamed is also the Hebrew word for an analogy. Okay, a mashal, an analogy, like Aesop's fables, called a mashal. The book of Proverbs is called Mishle Shlomo, like the Mishalim, the analogy or Proverbs of Shlomo. When the Midrash comments on the Bible, they say Mashlu Mashal. They created an analogy, typically. Analogy meaning here's an imaginary case which is a similar, structurally similar to the case at hand that gives us new information. Um, so with the word Tim Scholl can also mean create an analogy, to create an analogy. So I'm wondering if, in Steinbeck's considerable research, he said, wait, maybe it doesn't mean govern over it, but rather create an analogy for the human condition. Create an analogy for the human condition. So I would have never thought about that had I not done some research on Steinbeck and this apparent mistransliteration of Tim Scholl to Tim Shell, which slightly moves the word from to the Hebrew lahamshil instead of limshol lahamshil. And one of the meanings of lahamshil is to create an analogy or to create a teaching, which of course Steinbeck did when he saw the story of Cain and Abel as a mashal, as an analogy for the human condition. So I'm still on that. I haven't finished my research on the deep levels of Hebrew grammar, but I think it's there. So I don't want to repeat everything I've done so far. What I want to focus on for me is the fascinating fact that Genesis chapters 4 and 5 tried to tell the same story twice, and chapter 5 is a whitewash, is an erasure of chapter 4. So when people come to this over and over again, people say to me, but Rabbi Finley, what about all the begats and begats and begats and begats? Isn't it just boring to you? And I said, yeah, but I hadn't read it carefully enough because I thought it was just the begats and the begats. Chapter 4 takes the line of Cain, and the line of Cain, as you remember, perhaps the summary of that would be Lemech. Lemech says to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lemech, give me your ear. Have I slain a man by a wound and a child by my bruise? If Cain suffered vengeance at 7 generations, Lamech at 77. This is in chapter 4, verse 23. Now, you also have in the previous verse, in 420, Ada bor Yaval, he was the one who dwelled in tents and bred cattle. The other one was Yuval. He was the one who handled the harp and the flute. And then there was Tubal Cain, who sharpened all cutting instruments. So part of chapter 4 is the history of civilization, but the apex of it is Lemech, who says, yeah, I'm a murderer too. I murdered children. Um, and if Cain anybody who messed with Cain got 7 times what they did. I get 77. So all of a sudden, we see a prefiguration of what caused Noah's flood, which is the entire degeneration of humanity. Of course, the import of chapter 4 is we are all descendants of Cain, right? So there's something in the stain of Cain that comes down to us. And at the very end of chapter 4, uh, Chava has another child. Uh, um, Adam knew his wife again, verse 25. She bore a son, named him Shet. And now we have, again, she speaking. Remember, Chava, when Cain was born, she said, Kaniti ish et Elohim. I created a human being with God. She gets to name the third child as well. Um, uh, um, she says she names him Shet or Seth in English. Now, Shet or Seth is the opposite of Hevel. Remember, Hevel means ephemeral. Hevel means smoke, a wisp of smoke that's going to go away. Shet is a synonym to the Hebrew word lasim, or which means to place permanently. So Shet is the opposite of Hevel, you might say, meaning he's placed here to stay. And then it ends um, with this very strange verse I mentioned last time, chapter 4, verse 26. It says, um, Leshet Gamhu Yulad Ben. Shet also had a son. Pardon me. Vaikra et Shemo Enosh. They named him Enosh, uh, basically human being, but that it carries the redolence of a frail or mortal human being. And then it says, Az huchal likro b'shem Adonai. Again, this huchal can be taken in two completely different directions. One is they began to profane the name of God. Lechalel means to profane, but also huchal means to begin. Lahachel means to begin. Lechalel means to profane. I don't know the connection between them. So did people begin to profane God's name or call on God's name? We don't know from the end of chapter 4. The authors are brilliant enough to put something in the Bible that can be taken two opposite ways. So it's not that we don't know how to read it; it's that the author editors put in a term that is completely ambivalent, a completely ambivalent term. Um, the analogy I give is the word to cleave. You know, to cleave means to adhere tightly. It also means to cut apart. So when you see the word cleave in a sentence, you don't know what it means. In fact, we bring our own meaning. Like um, did he cleave to God or was he cut off from God? So this verb here has that same feeling. We don't know what it means because we're not supposed to know what it means because I think the authors decided to give us two choices. Did people begin to call on God's name or did they begin to blaspheme God against God? My teaching all along is that the image of the divine from chapters uh, uh, 2, 3, and at the peak in 4 is that there's that the divine figured here is something of a cruel loci kind of God that sets human beings up in impossible positions, um, uh, 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 plays con games with the human beings through the through God's able assistant, Mr. Snake, who has the con turned on him, sets up Cain, humiliates Cain, shames Cain, pushes him to a murderous rage, and then innocently says, "Why are you so upset? Why are you angry? Why have you lost face?" When God directly did it to him. And so, is this the part in the Bible where people begin to curse God? You are the Gnostic God of the Book of Job. Leonard Cohen. You want it darker? We'll kill the flame. You're the dealer. I'm out of the game. So are they realizing that this is Leonard Cohen's imaging of the Gnostic God in his final work, You Want It Darker? Or are they saying, wait, behind the Gnostic God, there's a true God? So one of my understandings of Genesis 2, 3, and 4 is the presentation of a Gnostic God. Gnostic God, an ancient idea of the divine comes out of the ancient Mediterranean. That there is that there is a lower God of the divine who's hostile to human beings, who's inimical of human flourishing. Um, and why is it in the Bible? As I said before, these stories were not written to be in the Bible. Remember, there was no Bible. There wasn't a national contest in Israel like submit something for the Bible. We're writing a Bible. It was a story. It was a Gnostic story. So who chose this? If it is a Gnostic story, and I believe that it is, who chose to be in the Bible? Why did they just leave it out? Was there some community that we're going to put Genesis chapter 1 in that is mostly positive, and we're going to put 2, 3, and 4 in that gives a whole other understanding of the divine? So it's so much more deep and mysterious and troubling than you imagine if you see yourself, I'm reading the Bible, as opposed to I'm reading a philosophic anthropology written by people who had a very ambivalent understanding of one aspect of the divine, the Gnostic aspect of the divine, versus another aspect of the divine that you see in many other parts of the Bible, especially in Psalms, a loving, caring, gracious, and forgiving God. Well, which is God? From my perspective, we're seeing depictions of God written by human beings, and Gnosticism is a powerful uh, uh, religious movement that reaches all the way back, I think, certainly into Greek times, and I'll say into Israelite times. Well, which is it? Now remember, our theologies are the lenses that stand between us and what I'm going to call the reality of God. So what we're reading is people's experiences, people's lenses of the divine, and like the ambivalence in the end of chapter 4, we have to decide which lens speaks to us, and for us, which lens actually gives us some insight into what we'll call the true essence of the divine. So see the Bible as not saying this is God, but it's how people experience God. And the editors, by giving us both chapter 4 and chapter 5, said two ancient lenses to God. You choose. Okay, that's my final introduction to chapters 4 and 5. Is God about Cain and Lamech and so forth, or the next chapter, which chapter 5 begins? I mentioned this briefly last time. Astonishingly, the Bible starts over again in chapter 5. So chapter 5 begins with, um, this is the account of the descendants of Adam. Uh, Zesefer Toldot Adam, Beyom Bero Elohim Adam B'demut Elohim Asa. This is the book of the generations of Adam. Beyom Bero Elohim, on the day of God's creating Adam, uh, B'demut Elohim Asa, in the image of God he made him. So it seems to be saying, this author saying, look, we're not going to even get into chapters 2, 3, and 4, Garden of Eden, the expulsion from Eden, the exile, Cain and Abel. Let's just start all over again. We're going to start with the day that Adam was created in the image of God and go from there. So chapter 5, in my mind, is someone said, we don't like all that stuff. We're going to start over again. So they wrote an entire, like a revisionist history of the origins of humanity. The editor said, well, we got 2, 3, and 4, or 5. Which do we put in? Because 5 erases 2, 3, and 4. Let's just start with, Adam, the creating the image of God, and goes straight to it's the following verse is astonishing. Vayechi Adam, and Adam lived uh, 300 years. Vayoled b'demuto b'tzalmo vayikra shemo Shet, and um, he bore um, bidimuto bitsamo, in his image and in his likeness. The exact same words when God creates the human being. In image and likeness, it says now that Adam is the one who created a being in his image and likeness and called him Shet. So Shet, who ends chapter 4, is now the first descendant of Adam in chapter 5. No mention of Hevel, no mention of Hevel, Cain and Abel, no mention of Eve saying, I created a man with God, no snake, none of that. It goes straight to Adam bore a child in his image and likeness and called his name Shet. Right? So scholars have no idea what's going on here. Again, I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm beholden to nobody. My professorship in Bible is not at stake. I'm going to say it was an alternative history. So, in my mind, with the intent to erase chapters 2, 3, and 4. Okay, I mean, it goes straight from chapter 1. The editors, in their great wisdom, said, we'll put them both in. Someone could say, but how can you have both? How can you have 2, 3, and 4 that has one entire story? And then chapter 5 that just begins with Shet. in my mind, the editor said, we trust future generations to work it out, which is we, right? We get to read both and say to ourselves, are we descendants of Cain? Or are we descendants of Seth? Are we the Cainites or the Sethites? Okay. Some days I look at history and I say, where it's just Cain getting worked out over and over again. I feel shame, therefore I'm going to kill somebody. Or are we Shet? The image of the full potential of the first human being, and are we beings of full potential to live our humanity to its fullest? Well, chapter 4 says one, chapter 5 says the other. You read both. Which one is an image into your understanding of yourself and humanity? Now, then it goes on. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just wanted to share with you something that I've never thought about until I decided to teach this to you, that 4 and 5 are actually statements of philosophic anthropology. The begots and the begat actually contains two competing philosophic anthropologies. Okay, that's my conclusion there. When you go through chapter 5, now Lemech says, remember Lemech, the one before, who like, I'm proud that I murder people and vengeance for me is 77. Look at the Lemech in chapter 5. He lived 182 years, begot a son, called his son Noah. So Lemech before is the murderer. Lemech in chapter 5 produces Noah, and he says, this one will bring us rest from our work, from the toil of our hands, and from the ground that God has cursed. So now the curse of the land is over because of Noah. Okay, so in chapter 5, we have the reversal of chapter 4. We are relieved of the curse in chapter 5. So chapter 5 undoes chapter 4 and much of chapter 3. Noah was 500 years old when he begot Shem, Ham, and Yafet, which of course goes into the Noah story in chapter 6. And then in chapter 6, if you haven't read this lately, hopefully you might have read it in anticipation for today, come some of the strangest verses in the entire Bible, right? In fact, when people think of, old time religion, say the Bible, they're over and over again forget that these verses occur. So let's take a look at them very quickly and what they say about us. This is now in chapter 6. Completely out of nowhere, the following happens. Chapter 6. Okay. Vayihi ki hechel Adam larov al pnei adama. When the human being hechel. Now hechel, remember, goes back to that play on words at the end of chapter 4. Hechel, is it to begin? Seems to be. Or is it connected to profane? So you could read the beginning of chapter 4. Remember, translators have to pick one or the other. Um, could it be in chapter 6, verse 1, when human beings began to greatly profane upon the Adamah, or began to increase? It does seem to me increase, but the author used the same verb, the same ambivalent verb at the end of chapter 4, cursing and beginning, same verb form. Two different meanings, but the same form in Hebrew. And then it says, Uvanot yildu lehem, and daughters were born to them. Vayiru b'nei ha-Elohim et benot ha-Adam, and the b'nei Elohim. Well, who are the b'nei Elohim? Well, sometimes b'nei Elohim in the Bible means angels. You see this in Psalms. B'nei Elohim might be the divine council that we spoke about before, but there's some kind of demigods. Now, when you read the Bible, you typically don't think of biblical demigods. Well, here they are. They are, as it were, children of God, but they're demigods in that. Here's what they do. They saw the Benot Adam, the children of Adam, or the females, kitovot hena, that they're good or good looking. Vayikechu lahem nashim mikol asher bacharu. They chose among the finest of the humans to be their wives. Okay, look at it. You don't believe me? Take a look at it. The demigods chose among the human women, Benot Adam, to be their wives. So they're not, I mean, they're not, as it were, completely divine spiritual, They're called B'nai Elohim, but they come down and take human wives. This is highly disconcerting for we who didn't think that demigods roamed the earth and chose women to bear offspring with them. Um, Now, what is God's response to this in verse 3? God says, Vayomer Adonai, Lo Yadun Ruchiva Adam, my spirit will not live within the human being, La'olam, forever. Um, uh, um, uh, Lo Yadun Ruchi Ba'adam La'olam, Vishigam Hu Basar, because he is also flesh, which means even though you're half God, you're also flesh. Vahayu Yamav Mea Ve'esrim Shana. They're only going to live 120 years. That doesn't happen for quite a while. But again, this is God's looks at this and says, this just can't go on. Although they are half gods, they're also going to die. Um, so again, a divine judgment comes in. But this idea of the demigods roaming the earth and taking women, not much is done with this. It's expanded upon in the Gnostic literature, especially the Book of Enoch. So I'm wondering whether I want to inflict upon you the Book of Enoch, but it seems to be about the right time. It is the most astonishing book in the what's called the non-canonical text, but exerted a great influence on Jewish Gnosticism, on hidden rabbinic Gnosticism that eventually flourishes in the Kabbalah. So the Book of Enoch has a strong secret influence on ancient Israelite thought, especially in Gnostic mysticism, and of course is the basis for John Milton's Paradise Lost. If you don't remember my making that argument, John Milton read the Book of Enoch. Um, for sure, if you do the research, the Book of Enoch was available to him, and his telling of Paradise Lost is in many ways strongly parallel to the Book of Enoch. It's an astonishing thing, but it's there. And then what happens is the following. It says, um, now we're in verse 4. Haniphilim hayu va'aretz bayim hayim. The Nephilim were in the land at that time. Um, uh, Hold on a second. Haniphilim hayu va'aretz bayimim hayim. V'gam achrechen. And also afterwards, meaning they're still around us today. Asher yavo b'nei Elohim el benot Adam. And they also, these b'nei Elohim, so the b'nei Elohim, either all are Nephilim, where they gained this additional word, Nephilim. They came to the daughters of the human being, vayaldu lahem, and they had offspring. Hema giburim. Now, gibor can mean a hero, but can also just mean mighty. It can mean a sense of, of giants. Of Gibor can mean a mighty warrior with a kind of value neutral. We get the sense here, this is not a positive term. Asher me'olam anshe shem, men of repute. Now, what was their reputation? From what we see later on in the Bible, a negative reputation. So these evil half-god giants roam the earth. The Bible author says they're still around. Okay, so as it were, a race of half gods of giants. The word Nephilim is from the Hebrew word nafal, which means, if you look in the book of Enoch, exiled from heaven because they rebelled against God. This is a Gnostic myth. They were sent down to the earth, or they were exiled to the earth. And if you look in the book of Enoch, they created all the evils in the lower realms in our world were created by these Nephilim. They are um, angel-like characters who rebelled against God, who were then exiled from heaven, came down here, created mayhem and havoc. So in the book of Enoch, these are the ones that brought this evil mayhem to the world that caused God to want to destroy the world. Somehow they just survived the flood, because when's the next time the Nephilim show up in the Bible? I'm sure Rabbi Manning knows. Does anybody know the next time, as far as I know, the next maybe only time the Nephilim appear in the Bible? Okay? Where they've gotten to. Okay. So we're going to go over, if you would like to follow me. over to the book of Numbers,
Talking about
chapter,
Og and Magog. Og.
uh, they're much later. Yes. I don't think they're called Nephilim, but they would fit that. Let's go to chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13. When the spies are sent to spy out the land,
They see giants.
they see giants. So let's look at those giants that they see. Um, uh, um, chapter 13, verse 33. Chapter 13, verse 33. The spies, they said, it's a land that devours inhabitants. All the people were huge. Um, and in verse 33, what do they see? Visham ra'inu et ha-niphilim. We saw the Nephilim there. B'nei anak, huge ones. The giants among the Nephilim. Vanehi be'einenu kechagarim, and we were in our eyes as grasshoppers. V'chen hayinu be'eineihem, and thus we were in their eyes. The Nephilim reappear on the stage of biblical history in chapter 13. The spies who got to Canaan said, we found the Nephilim, we found Bigfoot. All these, we found the Loch Ness monster. They're real. They're all in Canaan. If we go there, they're going to destroy us. And Caleb and Joshua said, yeah, so what? We can defeat them too. I don't care. Nephilim, Schmiphilim, right? We're going to get them. And they're going, no, 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 you don't want to fight the Nephilim. Right. So I have a point of view, if you're very mistaken, is that the reason the authors put in the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6, so that when you read Numbers chapter 13, you say, oh yeah, those guys. Because he said, look, we can put them in chapter 13. Everybody's got to want to know where they came from. We can either take the chapter 6, put it in chapter 13 to explain it, but that would take away from the dramatic arc of chapter 13. Let's go and put them in Genesis chapter 6, and when they reappear in Genesis 13, they go, oh yeah, those guys, yeah, we heard about them already, right? I actually believe it's true. I think the reason they're in chapter 6 is because they reappear in chapter 13. But the main thing is there's a belief in Bigfoot. There's a belief in the Loch Ness monster. There's a belief, whatever the snowman is. There's belief in, in a giant race populating the earth, inimical to human beings. And according to the spies, they all live in Canaan. Let's not go. Let's get back to Egypt. It was slavery, but it was better than fighting Nephilim. Caleb and Joshua says, yeah, we're not afraid of Nephilim. Let's just go in there. And of course, there was a rebellion. They were afraid to fight the Nephilim. They ended up staying in the desert for another 38 years, totally 40 years until the next generation. So why did the Israelites stay in the desert for 40 years? Were they wandering the desert? No. Did they get lost? No. What were they afraid of? Giants. They were afraid of the Nephilim. So if you've ever wondered why the Israelites stayed in the desert for 40 years and didn't conquer Canaan, the Nephilim, the demigod giants roaming the earth that for some reason or another decided to live in Canaan. Okay, Rabbi Manning.
Yeah, I like that because I always thought about the explanation for what happens in Exodus was that they were so overtaken by their fear that they remembered the stories around the campfire about the giants, and then they decided that those are the giants, and they weren't really giants. They just wanted a rational basis to come back
Yeah.
and really give a lot of credence to their fears.
Yeah.
But I like what you're saying. There's
They actually
actually
they actually were giants. They actually saw
right.
giants.
But we actually do have, I think, in Chronicles and in Devarim, passages that talk about the remnants from Og and the
Mhm.
size of their beds and how
Mhm.
huge they were. So there is that. I really think that it was more of just their terror taking over them as
Mhm.
far as the
Yeah.
spies
Yeah.
coming back and saying, oh,
Yeah.
remember these stories that we told around the campfire? They
Yeah.
have those guys there.
Yeah, we saw them there. So Caleb and Joshua seems to see, well, how do you kill a giant? Hit him in the knee. Okay, so their knee is about,
So
like my
David
eye.
resolved
Yeah, so
that.
yeah,
How do
exactly.
you
It's,
kill a
it's
giant?
Goliath. So what? Get a slingshot out, 5 2 stones, hit him in the forehead, and move on. So I mean, I just want you to think about again the human condition. One type of person says the problem is giant. Let's run. The other one it says, yeah, I'm a giant killer. So what? So I got to kill a giant. Okay. All right. I'll put it in my schedule. So there are those of us who run from giants, and there's those of us who kill giants. Okay. And the question is, which are you? Are you Caleb and Joshua who says, okay, so we have to kill giants? Or are you this one that says, the problem is so big, so huge, I can't stand it. I want to run back to Egypt. And then the idea is, well, you have a choice. Do you run from giants or do you kill giants? Of course, what I mean by giants is insurmountable problems that face us in life that you don't think you can find your way through it. And you say, I'm bigger than the problem. Now, I'm going back to my years as a counselor. There's oftentimes a Hanukkah teaching which is coming up, which is when relationships get so bad, people say anything in life, but oftentimes relationships, it's so bad, this can never, ever be restored. It's been defiled. Things were said, things were done. There's no way this can be repaired. And when I've had marriages come my way where people said, there's been infidelity, there's been lack of trust, it's over. And but they come to me anyway. Two people arrive in my office or on my camera, and I have one question to them. I say, "Is it possible that this could be restored? Is it possible? Not is it likely, but is it possible? And if it were possible, would you want it?" People say, "It can't be. It's too horrible. I'm too hurt. I'm too wounded. I'm too angry." I said, "I get it. In your mind, is it possible that you could restore a loving relationship? And if it were possible, would you want it?" I need both of you to say 50% plus one. Right? If it's more than 50% plus one, great. Is it 50%? Because if it's 49%, it's impossible. I don't want to talk you into it. If you say in the further reaches of my imagination, it's possible, I just can't imagine it, I say I can work with you. Now, so what do I see so many times in life? That for me is one of the worst. When the wound, the grievances are so powerful that people actually cannot imagine themselves getting better. People say, I'm ruined, I'm spoiled, I'm bad, there's something horrible about me. I can't imagine my living a flourishing life or a relationship. And this is oftentimes brought to me. I want to give you one other example. I'll try to do this in a way that no one can be identified by this, but I had a man who was relatively successful, like nice income, Beverly Hills, um, um, married with a couple of kids, but the marriage was awful. And he comes to me, had been to therapy, and for some reason it just never got better. And he, sometimes I'm the last resort guy. Like I've tried everybody else. I'm so out of options. I go to Rabbi Finley. I say, my reputation must not be that great. You try everybody but me. Okay, fine. At least you're here. And he said, I'm a pathological liar. He says, I lie, I hide for no good reason. I cheat. I'm just, I'm this man of stature, and I just do piddling, measly, terrible things that all the gold turns to lead. Not enough that he's a failure, but enough that it might all catch up with him. So, as Rabbi Manny might know, because you might be reading the Gershom Kaufman book on shame, that oftentimes is indicative of a shame wound. Some kind of deep spoilage within manifests. So I was very gentle, but I wanted to go back and see, if there's a shame wound back there. He shares with me the following: that his stepfather was talking to a friend, and the guy is 10 years old, within earshot. And he says, "So what about your stepson?" He says, he's not going to amount to anything. He's completely worthless. This kid's never going to go anywhere. And he shared with me that he felt I was hollowed out and filled with sewage. That's the words he used. I was hollowed out and filled with sewage. And I never heard a more articulate description of the shame wound. Just filled with sewage. Little 10-year-old kid, he's trying to restore himself. The man was in his 50s and could never get rid of the words his stepfather said to to the friend, the humiliation, the shame, the stigma. And he said, I want to know from you, can I get over the feeling that comes to me that I'm filled with sewage, the acting out that I do, which is part of me is I've seen couples for whom the idea was it's giant, it's Nephilim. There's an evil spirit that's taken over our relationship, or a person who's is filled with disgust. And their sense is it too big? And I think to myself, whatever I personally think, I gotta channel Caleb and Joshua. I have to channel the Maccabees. The defiled can be rededicated. Yeah, it's giant, but we have to be giant killers. And for me, that simply comes down to, an inner disposition, which I think is in many ways core to the story of the spies. The Nephilim from chapter 6 are taken to the spies, which in a way takes us back to the decision between Genesis chapter 4, Genesis chapter 5. Um, does the fact that we're descended from Cain rule us, which means the human race is fundamentally spoiled, or are we the children of Seth, which means we've been placed here to realize our humanity? So what I've realized is, in my own life, I've gone back and forth. I've gone back and forth. Can this be fixed? Is this redeemable? Can I bounce back? Maybe you've gone through this as well. So as I take the story and try to turn it from myth into philosophic anthropology, which is what I think we're supposed to do. We're supposed to take these mythic stories, learn them deeply, ingest them, see how they feel within us as poetry, and then ask ourselves, does this create an attitude toward what it means to be a human being? Which means, can we find meaning in these stories? Which means, do these guide me to find the meaning in my life in some ways? And I would say, yeah, Nephilim roam the earth. In fact, the Nephilim roam within us, destructive half gods that want to steal our souls. Yeah, that's actually true. Are we more powerful than the Nephilim? Well, theoretically, yes. So if that's true, then it comes down to skills. You want to kill a giant, you have to learn giant killing skills. So there are giants out there. There's evil giants roaming within. We have to decide, like Caleb and Joshua, we can do it, we can fight, we just have to learn how.